Dear all, thank you very much for participating to this webinar. As you know, this is part of a series of webinars organized by Work Package 4 of the ERICA project in order to stimulate the possibility of running a clinical trial within ERN healthcare provider. This is obviously open also to all the players in the field of rare disease, and in order to provide an opportunity for patients to have new therapeutic strategies and the possibility to be treated according to their needs. Today's webinar will be given by Dr. Viviana Giannuzzi. Dr. Giannuzzi is part of the Benzi Foundation, and the title of the webinar will be Essential Requirement Before Thinking About a Clinical Trial. Thank you again for participating.
Good afternoon, this is Viviana Giannuzzi from the Benzi Foundation, where I coordinate the research department, and I act as regulatory and ethical expert. In this webinar, Essential Requirements Before Thinking About a Clinical Trial, we will overview what should be done at the very least before starting a clinical trial in a study site. This is strictly related with the applicable rules. We will consider the requirement according to the role that an investigator may have in the trial, and I will also provide you some guidance and sources. In the rare disease field, the clinical research is so important as a source of evidence, considering that patients are few and geographically dispersed. Of course, we need to protect them. And for both these reasons, we need that clinical studies are well conducted, both from the methodological and from the ethical point of view. First of all, the investigator needs to know what is a clinical trial. This is not trivial. Let's see why. A clinical trial is an investigation in humans with specific aims, for example, efficacy and safety related to a medicine. Or we can investigate the PK/PD, the adverse events. And this is well stated in the known good clinical practice. Clinical trials are a type of clinical study. Clinical studies have specific aims that, in the case of medicinal products, refer to, as I mentioned before, efficacy or safety, as stated in the European Clinical Trial Regulation. In clinical trial, the decisions on the treatment and on diagnostic procedure is taken outside the normal clinical practice. So, what makes a clinical trial different from the standard clinical practice and the other studies? The clinical trials have, as I mentioned before, a PK/PD efficacy or safety aims, while the standard clinical practice is aimed to treat, prevent, or diagnose. The clinical trial has interventions, so we have investigational medicines that might be not already available on the market or still available on the market, but used outside the terms of their authorized terms. The standard clinical practice as existing marketed drugs. The clinical trial foresees experimental use of medicines. Of course, in the standard clinical practice, medicines should fall within the practice and should be used according to the terms of the marketing authorization. In clinical trials, we may add diagnostic and monitoring procedures than those foreseen in the clinical practice. The new clinical trial regulation issued in Europe also specifies that if the trial foreseen marketed medicines a diagnostic procedure outside the clinical practice, but these diagnostic procedures pose a minimal risk, this can be considered low interventional trials. And for this study, the clinical trial application dossier is simple, and insurance may be covered by the compensation system already in place in a study site. This is something that should be carefully considered in the right allocation of a clinical trial. Secondly, once identified which type of study you are going to perform, you need to know which rules apply. The three main references are the Good Clinical Practice, the European Clinical Trials Regulation, I both mentioned them before, and the Good Manufacturing Practice that complement the above two provision in relation with the handling of investigational drugs. The European Clinical Trial Regulation basically regulates all the steps of a clinical trials: the trial registration, the submission and authorization to competent authorities, including the ethics committee approval, amendment, the informed consent, and importantly, the clinical trial regulation provides some specific requirements also for informed consent for special populations, vulnerable population, pregnant women, and so on. And also the informed assent for children. It also issues monitoring, reporting, archiving provisions. How investigational medicinal products should be handled by the sponsor and at local site, and determination of a trial. This European regulation was issued to harmonize multinational trials because it issues a two-step and centralized authorization for trials, also in case they involve more than one European countries. The well-known GCP are the main internationally agreed standard, ruling also in this case all the phases of a clinical trial, but you can also find specific guidance on how the protocol and investigator brochure should be written. However, please consider that more documents contain provisions on the preparation of and conduct of a clinical trial. The Helsinki Declaration, the additional protocol to the Oviedo Convention, a reflection paper on clinical trials to be conducted outside the European Union, and the well-known GDPR, because in a clinical trial we need to handle, to process also personal and sensitive data. And if the trial aims to recruit children, further requirements apply because children need specific consideration, protection, and methodological procedures. We have a specific ICH guidance, that is the E11, that has been recently updated, and an additional protocol including specific information on the innovative methodological methods on the clinical research have been provided in the addendum. And we also have, importantly, a European Commission recommendation that is specifically focused on ethical consideration. Next, the setup of the protocol. Once you have well defined your trial and you have the rules to be referred to, the protocol should explain everything you are going to do with participants. You need to provide a comprehensive rationale and deal with informed consent and recruitment, the handling of biospecimen collected and analyzed in a clinical trial, the procedure, a risk-benefit assessment, and the management of research and health data. As I mentioned, the structure is to be sourced from the Good Clinical Practice Guideline. In case the trial involved children, we mentioned that further provision apply. For example, on informed assent, and we need to implement and to consider ad hoc endpoints, ad hoc procedures. The trial foresee genetic test. Even in this case, we have specific aims and endpoints. We need to consider genetic test in the informed consent documents and in the recruitment procedures, because these tests need to have specific aims and specific procedures that are likely to be a sub-study of the main study, in order to allow that participants may decide to, may accept to undertake the genetic test in addition to the main study. And then, if we have an advanced medicinal product in the trial, we need to comply also with a specific European regulation. Tissue engineering product, gene therapies, cell therapies are the example of advanced therapies, of course. And finally, according to the type of the study, the applicable rules, and the protocol, we need to know which responsibility everyone involved has in the trial. You need to prepare and conduct the trial according to the role you are in charge of. A clinical trial is made of different steps: the protocol preparation, the site identification, the clinical trial application, the site initiation and the recruitment, and the overall study management that includes the data management, the drug management, the clinical and technical operations, the communications, procedures, and plan. Then we have the monitoring during the conduct of the trial, pharmacovigilance, site and data closure, and then we have the data analysis and the trial termination. At site level, you may act as a sponsor, for example, in the research-driven trials, as a coordinating principal investigator, and as a principal investigator. The first figure is the sponsor, that is responsible for the site identification, of registering the trial in the relevant databases, for example, the European one, clinicaltrials.gov. He is responsible for to get the authorization and the ethics approval to manufacture and distribute investigational drugs, pharmacovigilance and monitoring activities. He usually acts as the responsible and the owner of personal data, transfer and sharing of data samples, management of financial issues, and follow-on. For example, amendments, study ends, and annual reporting. But don't forget that all these activities can be delegated, so the sponsor may identify someone else that could be in charge of these activities. Second figure, the coordinating investigator. This is a figure that is in the multi-center and multinational trials. So the coordinating investigator is responsible to coordinate the investigators at different centers in the same country. Basically, the coordinating investigator usually collaborates with the sponsor to prepare the protocol and the related documents, and it is to follow up during the conduct of the trial, or to manage the trial outcomes. For example, what comes from pharmacovigilance activities. And finally, we have the principal investigator. That is, of course, the responsible at each trial site level of all the team of the investigators. The principal investigator should be able to demonstrate to sponsor, ethics committees, and authorities that he has enough time, adequate facilities, and qualified staff, and the potential to recruit patients according to the protocol. So here is the list of all the responsibilities of the principal investigator. He needs to check if he has the needed expertise and facilities, and especially to carry out the informed consent, to collect samples, to perform the required test, to record data during the clinical trial, to manage at site level the medicines, the investigational medicines, to process data, so to collect, analyze, store, and share data. He's also responsible for the local documents that are required by the ethics committee or the administrative office of the hospital. He needs to check the possible conflict of interest. He needs to manage financial issues and insurance, and to manage, as I mentioned before, the investigational medicinal product, and basically the receiving, storing, dispensing, inventory, and disposing. He also needs to report adverse events according to the applicable rules in the context of pharmacovigilance activities. In case of pediatric trials, the principal investigator has further competencies and facilities that are needed to carry out informed consent that is addressed to parents and legal representatives, and informed assent, because we need to collect the assent from children, to inform children and collect their assent verbally or in writing, according to their age and maturity. At site level, it's the ability to collect samples from children that usually requires specific competencies or tools to micro-sampling from children, and avoiding pain, distress, and discomfort are needed, as well as specific measures to store biosamples from them. Very recently, a specific guide to undertake the informed consent and assent from children, and so children and parents, has been made available and has been published after a nice work that has been done within EMPRIMA, that is the network of the pediatric networks born within the European Medicines Agency. Particularly, this tool specify which element should be included in the informed consent for parents and legal representative, and which element could be appropriate for children according to the different age groups. So for neonates, for infants and toddlers, for school children, and for adolescents. So this is very useful to know what to include in the informed consent and assent documents. So how to undertake this process. And then we also have a specific guide to manage pediatric biosamples in pediatric clinical trials. And this is an easy-to-use tool. This is a checklist to be aware and be sure that all provisions have been implemented at site level to manage biological samples and associated data, because of course samples are associated with personal data in the design, in the phase, as well as during the conduct of pediatric trials. So, to summarize, the preparation and conduct of a clinical trials on drug must comply with a well-defined set of rules. The trial protocol must be well set up, and before starting a trial, all the requirements apply according to the role of the investigator. An investigator should be aware of what is a clinical trial, should apply the required rules, and have specific competencies and facilities to comply with the protocol. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for your participation to today's webinar. We have a very good number of participants. I invite everybody to send questions through the question and answer button. Please do not send your question into the chat, as the housekeeping rules are already specified. And I invite Dr. Giannuzzi. She is already on stage. Good morning, Viviana. And if there are already burning questions that needs to be, let's say, asked, Viviana is here for providing you already the question. We have already two questions. One from Edgar Delgado Etcher. Yes, the slide will be available for the audience. And we thank Matthias Schmutt that is telling us that everything is really clear. Are there any other questions at the present? Okay. I leave Viviana on the stage alone.
Thank you very much, Luca, and good afternoon, everyone. And of course, I'm available for any question. And just a comment. We are in a very important step of the clinical research in Europe, because we are now finally facing the novelties of the new clinical trials regulation that even if was issued in 2014, but right now we are in the application phase. So it's very important that everyone is aware of the new rules that would possibly simplify and facilitate the clinical research in Europe, especially for the multinational clinical trials that are very common in the rare disease field. It's very important that everyone is fully aware about these rules, because as I showed in my presentation, they really affect every role. I mean, it's not only a matter of the sponsor or the big pharma, but it really concerns every actor of the clinical research. I'm trying to answer to the question, if you like, Luca. Okay.
Please do so.
Okay, what other professional figures could support the principal investigator in the clinical research? There are a lot of actors that could support the principal investigator. At each trial site, we usually have a research team that is coordinated by the principal investigator, but also includes nurses, pharmacists, and other clinicians. It's a little bit recent, the awareness of the need for a specific expertise in the clinical research from nurses, from what is called clinical pharmacist, and there are figures that can really support the principal investigators. Sometimes we need multiple expertise from the clinical point of view, I mean. So we need that the principal investigator liaise with other clinical expertise within the hospital or outside. But don't forget that this should be clearly stated in the clinical protocol. So the clinical protocol should include every specialty that the clinical study needs to be properly conducted. I should say that another important figure is the regulatory expert, because as we see, we have, especially for clinical trials with medicinal product, we have the strong need to comply with the rules. So it's important that the principal investigator has himself or herself a knowledge of the regulatory provisions, but it could also be supported by specific experts. Last but not least, the patients, because is now well acknowledged that patients need to be involved in the design, from the design of a clinical protocol, of a clinical plan, clinical study plan. And these are, and then we have all the other figures that are well stated in the GCP. Then we have what other professional figures could support, who does the sponsor delegate the task to? Everyone. I mean, the sponsor now can be not only, as I mentioned, a pharmaceutical company or an SME, but could be a clinician itself. And in any case, notwithstanding who is the sponsor of a clinical study, every activity can be delegated to a clinician, an expert, or a CRO. GCP, as implemented by the national laws, identify specific figures that should be qualified. So what I would like to say that the sponsor can delegate everything or all the activities, but it's important that the sponsor itself or its delegate has a qualification, a certified qualification, for example, to perform pharmacovigilance activity, because we need to have the qualified person. In the same way, the monitors should be qualified. I hope that it's is enough, or please see if there is something that I need to.
Yeah, please remember that there is also an option to send by email your question, also in the next few days, and in order to, if you have further requests. There are two more questions. One from Matthias Schmutzer, that is, how can this such a trial be funded if there is no pharma sponsor? That's a very interesting question.
Yeah, it's very, very tricky question. I mean, if we are in a non-commercial setting, then it's really need to look for funds, but alternative, I could say, sources could come also from the hospital itself or from a scientific society. Some hospitals and even some institutional, national organization, ministries, and so on, can allocate public funds to for the clinical research, especially in settings like the rare disease one, have a poor commercial interest. Another important aspect is what I mentioned in the presentation is the proper declaration of the conflict of interest, because on the contrary, if we have someone that funds the clinical trial, in this case, we need to prove the ethics committees that which are the aims of the agreements or the funding of that trial, and with, for example, if there are commercial purposes or not. And if there are no commercial purposes in the clinical trial, then usually the ethics committees usually want to know if who is the data owner, or who is the owner of the results, and how the results are used or are aimed to be used for as outcomes or for in the future activities, and if they are transferred, and how, to a commercial entity, if there is any commercial entity involved. It's a little bit difficult. So if there are no pharma sponsor, I think that private or public funds are an alternative, or even so including the funds of the hospitals.
Viviana, just a question. This applies also for the repurposing studies?
Everywhere, and for every setting. Of course, for clinical trials, including repurposing, we have a lower commercial aim or the commercial purpose, but in any case we need to prove if there is a commercial entity that is funding or is involved in any way in the clinical trial, and we need to state everything. It's a very big issue, especially for example, in Italy, where we have the medicines with no or low commercial interest, like off-label drugs, like pediatric drugs that are old, and even in this case are used off-label. In this way, we have no commercial interest, but the point is that if we want to repurpose it, meaning that we want to use that drug in a different indication, different from the one authorized, then we have a gray zone where we have a poor commercial interest, because pharmaceutical companies are fully aware about the off-label use that sometimes is very widespread, so they have no interest to modify the summary of product characteristic leaflet. But we have a marketing authorization purpose. So, but in any case, the rules are the same, unfortunately, or we need to comply with rules, because every trial should provide real label results. It will be a waste of time, resources, and money otherwise.
Well, thank you for this clarification. Anyhow, I would like to remember to everybody that we will have a specific webinar on repurposing, and this will take place in the next few months. And the webinar will be given by Anton Ussi, that is the director of EATRIS, and also the coordinator of Remedy for All, that is the European project to set up a repurposing platform in Europe. Then we have another question from Araceli Diaz-Fraile. For non-interventional study, can a team member, i.e. study coordinator, no doctor, no nurse, no logopedist, explain the informed context to the patient?
I would clarify, first of all, the clinical trial setting, because as I mentioned before, it is the field that is much more regulated, and I could say also it's much more clearer, a clearer setting, because we have very strong and clear rules. So in a clinical trial, the principal investigator or someone from the investigator teams should be trained and should be able to explain everything that is needed to collect the informed consent. Of course, this is even more important or relevant, and requires more and further competencies in case of pediatric trials. In this case, we need to inform not only the parents or the legal representative, but also the patients. It's well recognized by the European Commission that children, according to their age and maturity, should be aware about the trial, should receive appropriate information and an appropriate material from the principal investigator or from someone that is able to provide in a proper way this information. And this is the informed consent and process should consider also the cultural and social diversity of people. And of course, the investigator team should be able to explain the best way, and of course in language that is spoken by the patients and the parents. In the setting of non-interventional study, unfortunately, we have less strong rules. We have no GCP, we have no European regulation, meaning that we have a common law that is valid in every country of the European Union, but we have recommendations and guidelines. We could have at national level the specific national laws. So for non-interventional studies, we need to rely to guidelines and recommendations. Of course, these guidelines and recommendations say that we need to be able to speak with parents, patients, and children. But we have no need to, we have no certification, no need, no mandatory no mandatory need to have an expert to undertake the informed consent process. We have guidelines and recommendations that suggest that a trained people should undertake the informed consent and assent process.
Viviana, since you are an expert in this field, may I ask you something about the dynamic informed consent? Because I think that this would be absolutely relevant and will easier the life of all the people in the clinical research field. Could you please provide us some hints? Because obviously this could be a topic just for one webinar, but I mean, just few hints, and maybe if this sounds intriguing, we can think about having a specific meeting on this aspect.
Absolutely, Luca. Okay. The dynamic informed consent is something that researchers really need to perform clinical research. I would include clinical research, not only the interventional one, but also and above all, the non-interventional one, or the one that is not linked to the development of a medicine, or but something that is much more linked to the clinical research in general, the registries, and so on. Why we need the dynamic informed consent? We need it because things may change, and if things change in a clinical trial or in non-interventional clinical study, we basically have to ask ethics committee the approval for an amendment. It is something that it may require a lot of time, a lot of effort, and considering this waste of time, we could miss something in our research. The dynamic consent could allow us and as a researcher to be quick. We could be more efficient in capturing all the novelties that we need to implement in our research. The dynamic consent could be a digital one, because of course it's much simpler to modify the informed consent by electronic means. The big problem is that even if we have a lot of efforts from researchers all around Europe that are working on building a dynamic consent, meaning that we have not a standard and fixed consent, but something that the researcher, but especially the patient, could change. Because if the patient could be allowed to change his point of view, to withdraw a consent that was provided for a specific use, or it want to add a further consent, for example, to store its samples for future research purposes. A dynamic consent, an electronic one, allows to have this quick modification. Otherwise, we need to contact the patient, or the patient should contact the investigator or the clinician to say, "Oh, I want to change my point to change my consent." The big limit of this very important step is the legislation, specifically the national legislation, because the electronic consent should be allowed by the national law. And so we can build very beautiful dynamic consent forms, electronic consent forms, but if our national laws does not allow us to use it, we cannot benefit from this important tool. Don't know if it's clear. Do you want some other details about that? Because of course we could speak a lot of time about that.
Eventually, if this is going to be a point requested by other speaker, we might think about having a specific webinar on consent and how to consent to a clinical trial, what are the requirements, and specifically how to use innovative system. The dynamic informed consent is one, but there are cartoons that are prepared for pediatric patient in order to explain them. So there are other aspects that could be raised to the attention of the people. If there are no other questions, and we are very close to the end of the time for this webinar, I would like again to give you some housekeeping information. As I was mentioning, Viviana is kindly available to answer to further questions that might come to your mind, since this slide will be available on the ERICA website, so everybody will have the opportunity to have a look to them. According to what is decided in the ERICA project, we will extrapolate from this webinar a fact sheet that will be again available on the ERICA website, and from the presentation and from the question and answer session, also a small video, few minutes video that will be posted on the ERICA YouTube channel for all the participants and for those that couldn't participate today to the webinar. So not only the slide will be available, but in next few weeks there will be also the fact sheet and also a video that will be extracted from this. I would like to thank again Viviana for her kind availability. I would like to thank everybody for the participation. We are quite numerous today, and the number of people that has registered is really huge. So sounds like that many people couldn't participate today, but they are interested in getting the slides and getting the information from this video. I would like also to remember that there will be soon, in the next few weeks, another webinar totally devoted to what is an orphan medicinal compound, an orphan drug that will be given by Dr. Armando Mangrelli, that is the vice chair of COM. Thank you again to all the participants, and if there are no other questions, see you in a few weeks.
Thank you all.